Okay, so let's return to our discussion of sensory systems. There's what we refer to as labeled lines. And so for transfer of sensory information from each of the sense organs, we have a single circuit or pathway that is specific for that sense. So there's one pathway for vision that transfers visual information to the brain. The same is true for hearing, touch, taste, and smell. So these systems are distinct. And so we've already gone over this slide, but it's just to emphasize again that information comes from the sense organs. You have a stimulus, it activates sensory neurons. That stimulus will generate action potentials in the sensory neuron that then projects into the spinal cord to create an effect. So we have what we refer to as the sensory system. We have many different senses. Common principles are that the physical stimulus will cause sensory neurons to be activated and fire action potentials. The action potentials then travel down the axon of the sensory neuron. And transmit the information into the central nervous system. Okay. And each sensory neuron carries a specific kind of information. This process is how we sense our environment. So for the remainder of the lecture this afternoon, we're going to talk just very briefly about the sensory cells that are important for each of our five senses. So in physics, have you learned about electromagnetic radiation? Yes? Okay. So there's a wide spectrum of electromagnetic rays going from gamma rays all the way up to TV, AM radio, AC circuits, okay, radar. So these all differ in the frequency of the electromagnetic waves. Our senses, in particular the sense of vision, only allows us to detect a very small part of this spectrum. And that's shown here. This is just part of the electromagnetic spectrum that we can sense with our eyes.
tanda weshil juda dina tawena anzu miki thongzor da dewe tanda nedi khari chadyorlana ta kyashe gyod reski di.
So visible light goes from approximately 400 nanometers to 700 nanometers.
Tanda anzu yue jura yue di thongro yue di tanda tawena khagas chagyorlana nanometer chi yawana shipya ni dunya phar chu res.
And these different wavelengths are sensed as different colors.
Di labse loga nganzu khari chorgyorlana khado loga chungyo res.
So the lower wavelengths here, from 400 up to about 480, are sensed as blue.
Ta labse chunga ro cha shawana tanda shibgya geju ro cha shawana di khari thongyorlawana labse dindi juyo na nganzu mombu thongyo res.
As we go a little further up the spectrum, we see green, yellow, and then red.
And then veshil ni ya draw na ani jango che sevo che ani dini mao chayo res.
Now this is what we as humans are capable of detecting.
Tanganzu gi tanda mi draw mi cha shawana mi gi khari thoya jura di tanda tyungyo res dina.
There are other animals that can sense a wider spectrum.
Thana shi kinge socha shimba ta waina quran zu gi milil hawa ani tanda veshil na ta waina quran zu manga thoya ga de chugyo res.
So for example, mice have photoreceptors in their eyes that can also detect ultraviolet radiation.
Tanda tsisi ro cha shawana quran zu gi wangsur da dewe quran zu gi khari thong thugo irlawana tanda mukchi yue jua di ya thongyo res tsisi riti.
And some species can detect infrared rays.
An yerik shimba din zu gi nganzu ma chi yue jua dinde ya quran zu gi thong thugo res sur thugo res.
But what we perceive visually with our eyes is just this limited range.
Cheza ngaran zu mi thoya jura di khandi tanda dinan tawana veshil dinala tanda ki di chuen di res ta gya shegyu.
So the eye is the sense organ of vision.
Ta tanda nganzu thongzor da jewe wangbo cho di khari cha dyorlana mi di res.
Light comes in to the eye through the cornea and through the lens.
Ta tanda yue di cornea dinin ju res an di tanda thangshil yora mi gi thangshil na li res yue di.
And then on the very back of the eye here, we have the neural portion, which is actually a part of the central nervous system, that is called the retina.
Ta tanda mi gi gyap cho ji dos dinan tanda ngazo wangza da jewe di cha di res mala da jewe di wangza da jewe khari cha dyorlana ngazo mi gi thagi le di res gyap di.
So the light that comes in through the front of the eye changes the activity of the neurons in the retina.
Ta yue di chi ni li yoras di yue di ming nang le sa jela an mi gi thagi nang gi chego di gyo tang gyo res.
And so if we look at the blow up of the retina, you can see that there are many neuronal types.
Di le zeta tanda mi gi thagi dos di ya chimbu syo ainas par de chimbu syo ta ainas dindesh thong res di na la khiran zu ta aina wangza thaso min ra mangbush thong dos.
So we have the rod and the cone photoreceptors.
Ta dina la nele ba cha sha aina ngazo yip thabung da yip thabung chama thoya dos dina.
We then have another class of cells that is called bipolar cells.
Thana shi ani ne ni yo ne ni dengi thabung rig di thoya dos chela.
These are all neurons.
Di chama wangza thasu res.
Okay. And then there are what are called retinal ganglion cells.
Thanda ngazo thagi gi chadu rig di ani sumba di chadu res rimba sumba dina.
The retinal ganglion cells gather all of the information from these other cells, and their axons project into the brain.
Ta tanda chadu juda di khar chigyo lawana tanda onza thasu shimbe ni ne su din su du an din ne su di ya ani level ya tangyo res.
And the nerve that is formed from the axons of the retinal ganglion cells is called the optic nerve.
Ta tanda di chadu changma ni ya ne su du ni ne su tangsa jura di chadu gyo dil khar le lana ngazo tanda thongzo da dewe ni wangza di chadu res.
And we'll talk more about this in the third lecture this week.
Di jelani tanda dunda di na la di gal shikra ma du res.
Okay. Next slide. But it's important to understand that while the retina is detecting the light coming in, that it's going to the brain, and it's in the brain that we interpret that so that we know what we're seeing.
tanda nichu lingi di cho de da thagi lingi yores di nichu du sa jala ya khol tang gur lawana level tang yores andi cherim jurim di drone ani tanda nichu khari yeme di ha khoya cho di kho cha de lana level al cha yores.
If the optic nerve is damaged due to an accident or in some cases a genetic disease and it degenerates, the individual can no longer perceive visual objects in his or her environment.
Ta kesi megyon ro shur da gyon ro sho ni nazar ro da dende kengi tanda thongje wangza dil kyon sho ainas ani tanda ngobo khari ime jora di tanda nebe denju rigi ani yawo yawa chetu yeje chetu yo mares thongtu yo mares.
So even though the light and the light from the image acts on the retina and retinal cells may still respond to it, the person can't perceive it or interpret what's there in the visual environment.
Tanda nesu di le da ligi yores thagila khari ime jora yo gi gyuni ligi yores ani thagi gi yalin chigi yores ine nesu di khari ime tanda cho nesu dodo sungi chu gyurim di khwa dugor lana lebana dugo yoras ta tanda di cha shawana thongje wangza di kyon sho sa jala ani nesu khari ime jin thwe jora di dushe di ligi yo mares.
So the sense organ for hearing is the ear.
Ta thusur wangche thusur da de khari cha de lana wangbo di manzo amjo di cha de res.
So how do we perceive sound?
Ta manzo da lai di khandis jingyu res.
So sound is essentially sound waves. They're changes in vibration.
Ta manzo da lai di khandi jil jingyu la na thanda di lab mo jin chi res ra lab di dargu chi ojila.
Okay. These are periodic disturbances that travel through a medium of air or water.
Tanda di droegi drodangi gyurim di khari gyuni dugu la na yana chu yana lung di gyurim chi gyuni ani lab di dugu res.
So those sound waves enter through the canal and act on a membrane here in the middle ear.
Tanda chi inna ni tanda da dili ros lab di lab dili ni ani manzo di phanna jura di phanna dela ani kimoji res di gal thegi res.
There are then a series of bones in the middle ear that then act on this organ that has the actual sense cells for perceiving sound.
Ta tanda di nesu di khol mir la na di lab di tanda ruba mangbush toas di phanna di ruba di gal li res and di kala tanda wangzor tanda da surning gi cho wangbo di telale di res.
And remember, these are referred to as hair cells.
Tengo ni tingu dos phabu thabong la ni yas di res di.
And the vibrations cause these little processes on the hair cells to be bent, which then activates these neurons.
Tanda dargu yungu res la ro dargu gi kengi tanda phabu thabong di gang la nech do di yogu chi res di ge ni nechu di ma tang res thabong di no.
And these neurons then project into the brain.
And di nechu di tanda wangza thasu di khol li di yor la na ni level la tang res.
Okay? So the organ is referred to as the cochlea.
And tanda di nechu di tanda di wangbo di khar la yor la na cochlea la yor res ting ling la.
And while it's normally a swirled structure, if we were to linearize it, we can see that different parts of it have hair cells that respond to different frequencies of sound.
Ta tanda cochlea la ni khorki la ni ibji do wangbo di ke sente nana suni ta oina di na la ne logo logo yor res di ge ani tanda lapse logo logo di ngujin chi tunge tinde ne logo logo cha de res.
And the hair cells then form synapses with other cells that project into the brain.
Tanas di phabu thabong di khari nyam du thunjam su de la oina wangza thasu shimba nyam thunjam su res wangza thasu shimba di ani leba da de cha res chi res.
And we'll be talking about this in lecture 5, is that right? Okay, so more on that. Okay, the sense of taste.
Ta manzo ro dan de wangso di is.
We can taste many things.
Ta manzo mo mangbo ji ro yu ni chor pu yor was.
So we can taste sweet, sour, bitter, salty, and what is referred to as umami.
Ta tanda manzo khari khari chor pu yor la nas ro yu ni 지 가르쳐 되려는 ngamu 지 교무 지 카디 아니 지 단다 umami 라이스도 된주 추구레스
Umami is usually perceived as something savory.
다 umami 라는 아주 좋아 야부 용이 리주라 딘데리나 망체 추구레스.
So on the tongue there are taste buds.
당 아주 단다 젤리 갔다 와나 디코라 단다 좋아 용이 기 taste bud land 유레스 부르숙 튕겨시다 디레스.
And within the taste buds there are many different gustatory receptor cells.
다 단다 아주 부르숙 튕겨 디기 나올 가리요라 와나 마라주 로다 데웨 아니 닐린 타봉 유레스.
And these are distinct for the different things that we can taste.
딜레드 디 로가 기 아주 뭐보 내가 로 아주 초레스도 로이주니 디 아니 튕겨레스.
They have, again, little processes that are referred to as gustatory hair.
단다 디나라야 네 디나 떼어나 부르숙 하시스 튀는데 도스닐라 딜 아니 파부 단다 타봉데 데 파부는 지 수디레스.
And they bind the different chemicals that we're capable of tasting.
디기 카리다 테기르라와나 단다 칭조 제리조라 딘데다 칭조 수유레스.
So for example, there are specific cells here that will respond to sweet, to sugar.
다 차샤와나 딜라 타봉 체라바지기 디기 카릴 야린 티기르라와나 ngamu 요라제 ngamu 릴라 야린 치유레스.
And I don't respond to things that are bitter or salty.
다나시 타봉 디기 ngamu 랑라 야린 치유레스. 아니 단다 카디다 규무다 딘데릭라 야린 치유 마레스.
So these cells form synapses with the fibers, the nerves that form the fibers of the cranial nerve, the neurons that form the fibers of the cranial nerve.
디 정말 뒤니 자규지 차교레스 디 자규데 카리 차되or라나 tö르 왕제 요라 디단테 차되레스.
And we'll be talking more about this on the 6th lecture.
디 먼저 소된 투바 두라스 진다 디나니 케란스 디마 시프타 두레스.
Okay, sense of smell.
다 nomsur 다 tizur 다 devenis.
Okay, this is referred to like the sense of taste as chemoreception.
다 단다 디 제 단다 릴린 칭이 조라 디로 차교레스.
So deep within our nasal cavity, there are specific receptor cells that are capable of responding to different chemicals that are suspended in air that create the sense of different smells.
딜라도 단도 아주 나구나 따와나 디 나노 넬렘바 요레스 디게 카리 넬린 치교 라와니 야린 치사 조디 룽기나라 제릭 다미도 요로스 디 아니 쿠란소 체니 아니 카리 메디 수르비 요레스 제릭 민다 테니.
So these are olfactory sensory neurons that have processes that contain specific proteins that respond to different airborne chemicals.
딜라도 단다 디 왕자 차소 디 와라 네 튼셰 조스토 디 차시 디 카르치교 라와나 단다 kem 제르레라 쿠란소 야린 치아주라 디다 데 티가르 디 요레스텔라.
And these neurons project directly into the olfactory bulb, which is part of the central nervous system.
다 단다 디 왕자 차소 디 야 카리다 튜드 라와나 단다 테베 왕자 말다 데베 단다 티조르 데베 자두시토 디다 데와 차디오레스.
That will also be covered in lecture 6.
단다 디 아니 단다 레슨 투벌 리라 디가 수십자 조에 있으마.
Okay. We then have the cutaneous senses. Cutaneous.
단다 빡빡다 데웨 양 초와 조라 딜리요 레스죠.
These include touch, pain, and temperature.
다 단다 디나 카리 추고 라와나 렉차 디체 체 아니 나숙 디체 아니 차실라나 트웨젤라나 디 추고 레스.
So these have sense organs in the skin.
다 덴주기 왕보디 콜레요 라와나 빡베나 요레스.
Okay. So there are within the skin specific cells for detecting hot or cold.
믹세 타봉 요레스 디게 타봉 카시기 카리 소르고 라와나 트웨도야나 타무도디 소르고 요레스. 사제디.
These are referred to as thermoreceptors.
다 덴졸 카리라요 라와나 트웨니레 바디 차도레스 타봉 디게리라.
There are other specific neurons or sense cells called Meissner's corpuscles, which sense touch.
Tanda mixe tanda onza tasuchi career lawana rekcha the deures rekcha la yalin chigures dige rigla Meissner's corpuscle lagures.
There is another class of cells called nociceptors, which sense pain.
Ta chik sumu da dewa nasu da dewa di ani chorgin di khari chagur lawana ni sungi nele ba di cha deures nociceptor lagures.
And then others that sense pressure.
An shimba chik khari chungur lan thamach da di nenshu gura nenshu di chungures pakwe kala.
Okay? So the sense of touch has many, many different types of receptor cells.
Chezang anzo paksor jura di dan dewa shiwainas ani di dan dewa wang di tasu mangbu ji chudures tabu mangbu yures dinari.
Okay. Now another sense that we didn't talk about in terms of the 5 primary senses is referred to as proprioception.
Tadana di nga da mandewe chik shires di khar chairlana pabgyur nelin chawlen pabgyur nelin ba chadures.
This is the sense that allows us to understand or perceive our position in space.
Di khari di choro di khari shegyur lawana manzo tongcha yura di na la ngaran choi khosa kho yeme di choro di hakotu yures.
So for example, I can tell I'm leaning sideways.
Chezani nga khari shetu lana nga thanda sekne deus la jura di an shetu yura soso khosa di.
Or without seeing it, I can tell that my arm is extended up. So there are specific receptors within muscles and joints that allow us to perceive the position of our body. There are also chemoreceptors for internal regulation. So these help our body to respond to changes in physiological processes. For instance, there are sensory neurons in your heart that send information to the brain about how fast your heart is beating. And it adjusts the rate of your heart accordingly. So these sensory neurons, you may not even perceive their activity. So can you think of things in terms of your own bodily function? Where we have sensory neurons that are transmitting information to the brain to regulate our physiology, but you're totally unaware of it. Any ideas?
Blood, circulation of blood.
Right? So circulation of blood, the amount of oxygen in your blood, the amount of carbon dioxide in your blood. So these sensory neurons transmit information into the brainstem. And for example, if the oxygen level is low in the blood, the brainstem will send information to increase the rate at which you breathe.
solung khaga sume ani naulung khaga sume di shi ras an thanda pe shawana ni su di khol lirlana thanda thagi juni jungbala li di leshab la li ras dilli du golani leba ge kharit ta dangir lawaina thanda solung di nyung thashas nyung thawaina ani tada dige jura pudis chedi di chigures.
So while we have the 5 primary senses, there are many other important roles for the sensory nervous system.
Ta thanda nganzo zo wangsor nga wa she roas. Di mai be thanda ngaran zo wangse mala da di da de wangso shimba mangbu ju roas.
Okay. So we have again what we refer to as the sensory system.
Ta thanda dige chama nganzo khari na chu la na wangsor mala na chu res.
Okay. We have many different senses.
Nganzo wangbu min da mangbu ju.
Physical stimuli cause activation of sensory neurons to fire action potentials.
Chi kuge la tene an nganzo wangsor thasu jura dila le juk ni baji thopke roas.
The action potentials travel along sensory neurons to the central nervous system.
Ta thanda le juk ni baji tu ra di ani thanda wangje thasu ni ma du res.
And each sensory neuron carries a specific kind of information to the brain.
An thanda wangje thasu re re gi ni chu re re level ya khidu res.
So in neuroscience, the sensory system brings information from the periphery to the central nervous system.
Ta thanda wangso thasu di chele khari dugur la na thagor yora di thani ni chu di le ni an tewe wangje mala mati res.
However, much processing within various centers throughout the central nervous system and the brain are what allow us to have conscious perception of an object in the outside world.
So it's the central nervous system which allows us, right?
Yeah.
Tanganjo chi la khari chungbu image ra di ani thanda ni su durup chinge laura da so yurim di call do la na jinsa de so di tewe wangsa mala cha de res.
So perceptual awareness is due to the sensory information that is processed in the brain.
Ta dana nganjo jian jura ni su jian di thanda yurim dosa call do de la na thangbo chi thagor wangse mala guni ni su ra di cha ros.
So in neurons, when we speak of the sensory system, we're referring to transformation of a physical stimuli to action potentials through specific classes of neurons.
Ta thanda di ke je shidu khari chawor la na chi ku gen chik chera niba dojil cha shanes chi niba jile an digi leju niba tungu res an di ma tangu res ni sudi.
However, once the information reaches the central nervous system, there are many neurons and processes that are needed in order for us to have conscious perception.
Ta thanda di jian jura zo di thand dushe le di thanda le chidu thanda di ne chu di ma le cha yela tewe wangja mala na thabung mangbu shu ji la ga chi res thang na shi gyure mangbu shu ji tu res di mangbu do sa yela an dushe di tu res ke res.
As well as unconscious actions like changing our heart rate or breathing rate.
Ngazu rangi thanda susu rangi chujin laura dende machini thanda cha shaina ningi pharding da dende oktong len chea da disang susu rangi tangji chigiyo marwas.
Large portions of the brain are devoted to processing of sensory information.
Ta lebe gi ne mangcheo di khol shair laina ngazu ne chu durup chea jura wangsur thasula di wangsur da dewe ne cha res.
This allows us to recognize faces or to understand speech.
Thana shi keda go sue jura ke khari ke me di go sue da thana shi mi su me dong la ta ni mo she jura ye che da di sangma ngazu che tu res.
And these parts of the brain have improved through evolution.
Ta di lebe gi ne den zo ngazu pheju du ras pheju du ani rim ge khorai khombel yar ke du res.
And allow us again to do something like recognizing a face, or even to look in a mirror and recognize the image as self.
Thana shi ta dongba mi shimba imba di ngo shi wa che thana shi ani susu dongba imba shegol ta ni ngazu she tu ras di nge ire la jora ta la di ni yawa che tu ras.
So some things to think about.
So okay, sorry.
So is it possible to sense something without perceiving it? Is it possible to act on such a sensation? Give me some ideas.
Diga tanda tiwa ni sheso di ani kyanzo samchu khari yosa diga. La thambo dila. They have views on the first one.
Okay. What was it?
Thambo dikhare. That chik choro that lago chawena choro shira di choro res ine dushe ke mares di tiwa thambo lo da khang shila mi be dushe ma ge par thela mi be bangso ke si thambre da ke serious. We can sense that. It's possible.
Okay. So one example is a simple spinal reflex.
Okay.
For example, if you put your hand on a hot plate, you have a very fast reflex that makes your hand move before you ever feel the heat. Eventually you do perceive the heat, but you actually respond before you do.
Ta dushe ke jura di khadu ligir lawana jela ligir res ta kherangi thanda yalin te di khongla cha de res nela cha de res.
Okay. Another question for you is, does an organism need a nervous system to be alive, to react to the environment and to be sentient?
On ta distinguish chusun chebala ther wangza mala ngeba kho inam res. Te shindu kingwe tegi koryug la yalen trebala te ngebar khwamlish. Kingwe te semjin tu gyurba te ngebar khwamlish. Thangbo di kingwe shi chusen chebala te wangza mala ngebar khwam lagi gore go mare. No, the first question, first part of the question, it's not needed.
Okay. That's true.
Nervous system is not needed for survival.
So give me an example of an organism that is alive that doesn't have a nervous system.
That chusen chitugre la ros an dinde imba na kiran su pesun ji shadas wangza mala mewa che chusen chingi kengwe chi zixing plants.
Plants. Okay.
Zixing che ani nya pigbi jellyfish.
Jellyfish have a nervous system.
Nya pigbi la wangza mala yores. La khare inshallah na khare khanje hambur rigre. Okay, shamo rigre. It's a type of fungi.
Okay. Fungi, I would say, don't have nervous systems.
Ta hambur rigre la rosa ji.
Okay. Now, are they?
Hambur riglas type of fungus.
Are things that don't have a nervous system able to respond to the environment?
Wangze mala mewa chera ani susukuri le yalin chigi yorwes. Yes.
Sure. So there are some plants that if you touch the plant, it actually changes its shape. It retracts.
Tanda zixing kashe yorwas Quran solo wangze mala yomaris ine nganzo lakwa ro chang ina ko khajir lana tharing ru du das if the go du das zixing di.
So the last part, do you have to have a nervous system to be sentient?
Ta simji imba ina dila di wangze mala go yorwes simji imbala. Go mare. Not needed. No, go mare. No, it's not required.
It's not required. Okay. So give me an example of a sentient organism without a nervous system.
Ta simjin jik pesun shadalas di wangze mala mewa che ani kengwe imbara. So the ones who stays in Tugdam state, Tukdam state, higher lamas who, even after death, they sit in the same position.
Okay. Okay. So they at least started out with a nervous system.
Ine kunzo gozodu wangza malani gozo ruas. But during that stage, his nervous system, it's not working.
Perhaps not.
Peje yogi mares.
Okay. So give me another example.
The peje shimba shadas. Chasi bacteria.
A what?
Bacteria.
Bacteria. Okay. So bacteria do respond to their environment.
Ale tanda chasi ro chashwa na korangi koriule yalin chigi yores.
Do you think that bacteria are sentient beings?
Ta keranzo samsu kharu yosa chasi di simje reves. Yes.
Do you think
The
they
secha
have?
di mata simje sentient beings like.
All right. How many people think bacteria are sentient beings?
Oh, the keranzo tanda chasi bacteria juya di ani simje re samge khazu cha kyamdas.
Okay, kind of a split. Okay, so maybe we could show them a video. Not now, but not now. So do you think bacteria have consciousness?
The keranzo sambala chasi bacteria la sheba yore samgu doesa. Yes.
All right, let's go to the summary. Okay. All right. So let's summarize a few of the key concepts that we went over today.
The kodun so den so ta jugdom rodnyam do dom shay instic.
Okay. So science is a method of inquiry.
Chik di khari share la na ngonzo tharing de la chode na la seri de chize gi thablam shigi ba share res.
For us to perceive our environment, we must have sensory receptor neurons.
Ta ngonzo tanda koryu denen ya cho gugu yonas cho de la chu gugu yonas ngonzo dil khar gugu res gyuram dila nelim ba gugu res.
And these sensory receptor neurons are distinct for each of our senses.
Nele thabum de jo ani wangbo re la loga cha de res.
We then have sensory pathways
Thana shi wangchur dalam ya yorwas.
that transmit the information to the brain.
Di wangchur dalam di khar chigir la na nichu di level ya kirin chigir was.
And within the brain, we have sensation and perception.
An lebe nanglo langa jo wangchur ta dushe di ki yorwas.
Okay. So there are a number of terms that you should remember. These are sensation,
Ta kiran jo thangye dige ani thibana shagu res. An chi khar lana tharin sa di sensation and wangchur was di.
perception,
An chi di dushe res injina perception like dos.
sensory receptors,
Wangchur nelim ba chagyo was thangye chi di sensory receptors res.
the five senses,
Ani wangbo ma di wangchur ma di res wangchur ma di five senses like res.
transmission of sensory information,
And wangchur chati dendong cheba di ani transmission of sensory information chagyo res.
and neural pathways.
An wangze dalam neural pathways lagyo res di.
And we're going to try and give you key words to remember for each of the lectures this week.
Ta chode re re duros di dosa jalani khiran sula thange cho den khari chagyo di khiran sul ma ti res.
And we'll give you definitions for these.
Ani thange chibu mai ba di gi thanda khari me jura deshe danyam do yores.
And a little bit later in the week, there will be a vocabulary quiz.
An thana ji khiran zo nanglo dendur che res thange gi dendur jura di chel tang res roj.
So it's important to try and learn these key terms.
Che za ta di thange den zo so thange den zo khiran zo jangwe khechum chagyo res.
Okay. Are there any questions?
Ani tiwa US khiran zo mane.
Yeah.
Tukang lo wangchur mala yo mares. So I heard that mosquitoes don't have do not have sense. So when the mosquito bites a person, does he sense the taste of blood of that human?
You know, I cannot say that senses the taste of the blood, but the mosquito knows that it's getting the blood, so it does sense that it is getting blood. But I've never been able to understand exactly what the mosquito perceives. Mosquitoes do have a nervous system.
So, in your lecture, you mentioned that sound is a wave, but in your lecture, you said sound is a wave.
Yes.
So, but in our previous classes, we were taught like sound is both a wave and a particle.
Okay.
So we must know about that.
Well, it is. So it's a vibration in air, and air has particles.
Res di dar lungna darbu choj res ani lungna kharu lawana du din zo res.
But the thing that's important is the frequency of the oscillations of those particles in air.
Ta khari khechumbu chadolana thanda du din zo yama yogu chigo ras digi docho jo ras di lungna docho khagasume di khechumbu chagyo res.
So the ones that have very high frequency waves we perceive as high-pitched noise.
Dila dubalada da pha laura de ro khoya di kharu lona docho thoenas di taglab jitungu ras di docho thoena thanda dach tun swas de khugu res.
And the lower frequencies are perceived like the polyphonic chanting.
Dila du thanda ngjo docho mayona da hande ju khur lana amjuna la thanda ngjo shendu kyodu kala da pombush tangi yas di do khugu res study.
Which I wouldn't attempt to try.
The dad can the $2 shendi also do one. The other that Tasha would choose some Marisa train. Can the choose? Bukamba can do it, Leo Arana. Longer in the digres.
Lunga digres, and Kuru Pamani Moshi or the Master Bonia to Ani Tani, Takemisha, the Bisman, which is cigarettes.
Pama Moshi and Shimbahalembe.
Lonia to the Tani, that goes on Carche, Kuru Gemisha, to the Suman, which is cigarettes.
Bu Arra digi.
Ara the Keres in
Ari. Ale ma bu Arra. Karata Gonida, Arila, Fuji Kereso. Coral Onze Malayomares. Leba Yomares. In a Pama motion, the rest.
Lunga de Amase,
Pama motion.
Suzuki Pama to Moshi or to it to Tani, no, that Timothy at Sukarina from Gemisha to Mahabu.
The Alinchi to your restaurant.
The King Channel Lebanon, Dalet on the Lebak Machi Channel, the Lebanon and the troop, Chilegamazian, Cheso.
So you said all the processes happens in the brain when you talk about perception. So I have read in a book in which it is mentioned that in America there was a child born and he was without brain. And he lived for 5 years, and the brain without having a brain, the child is still able to recognize his parents and family members, and also that when he watches TV, he responds to what is happening in the TV, like laughing and all. So
I don't think that is possible without a brain. You may have read that, but I don't think it's true.
But I have read it in a book.
Well, not everything you read in a book is true. The same thing, don't believe everything you read on the internet. Some of these things have been termed alternative facts. Some people believe them, but they're not true. We still have some time. There we go, back there.
So there are two questions. The first one is when you talked about bats. So you said it locates its prey by different objects by echolocation. So why don't you include this sense in sense of hearing? And the second question is so you have mentioned about senses which the cells which senses heat, and the other one which senses touch. Right. Why don't you include these two together in one?
Why do we include them?
Why do you separate these two?
Okay.
Why they can't be together as one?
Okay. So for the echolocation question, this is just a way of localizing something in space, which is kind of different than just hearing something. And we think it uses different type of neural processes.
So do you mean in the brain or what?
Well, they have a means of sensing it.
The palm di karda. Nedi. So he has a question. So he said the information.
Hang on just a sec.
And he said like the information received by echolocation and by hearing something, when this information goes to the brain, is it the same location or is it a different location in brain which receives it?
It's probably a different location. The brain of a bat is very different than the brain of a human.
그제 로가 인사요 산네디. 다 단다 파왕기 레바다 미 레바디 벳 로가 차도라스 미로 요레스.
So you can give the example to the students of there's a boy who was born blind, and he learned to create clicking sounds with his tongue.
Clicking sound.
And the echo came back to him. He could use his auditory system to navigate. He learned to avoid curbs. So he was perfectly blind, but he could use echolocation like a bat. But this is an example of the adaptation or the plasticity of the human brain to use echoes to navigate instead of sight.
다 단다 배선지 샤워나스 파왕나 시라 디 단다 드답니 답처 디 피주 체스도 디 로차 샤워나 부구지 요레스 부구디 롱와레스 롱라드다 미기 통네 지에 요마라고 두셰디 디 요마레스 이네 코랑기 다지 퉁고레스 먼저 클릭 레 다지요 언데 다지 퉁도가라 다디 답 아니 디 다디 코랑 소르고레스 디 소르도가라 아니 코랑기 랑가 호 도고요메 지라 통고 메네기 디 다디 피주치니 단다 답차스도 디 피주치니 아니 코랑 호 도고요메 디 코랑 컴디테니 디 드로트여 차이레스 다 단다 디 계제 하르시고라나 레베 딜 타나가 조 옌체랑 신주요 디 요아다니 컴디테야다 디 계제 시요레스
And then he had one more question.
And to a younger US. Niba the correct the heat to down lecture. Okay, about the heat and the touch.
Okay. So this is what we call cutaneous senses. And so we group those together. They're primarily senses from receptors that are in our skin. So we call them cutaneous senses, and that's why we group them together.
The did someone Losel get now Tangures, Kayasana did now Zokari Paxor Nal Tangures Konda. Paxor Nakajin Tangurlana, Tanda the one Chasu Mambujidas, the get some call and New Lona, Pabena Ures. Chesan did some Paxor Nal Lushes, Tabum the gate.
Jadila tini korom tugi kose jakon chase nebjora jadigi telefon korom samotong neb hapo duma ku japuchi amcho jora tigi neb hapo yore
amjo dil tene ha go re yana samlo dane
nasi tante ti tino gotong ne tia ina hong ko di jadigi ko jadila tini hong korom chobon chi tade
ne de dre
dina iseri tigang duma 제가 암초 뛰기 시작되는 것까지 하고
암초 디기 칸데 하고 그래서 계란지 삼바 가리치네 하고 그래서 거든요.
맞지 삼바 다 그거 니업 그거는 고사디 하고 그랬어요. 고사디 하고 있는데 그런 거 너무 다지 그니 다딜라 돈 그런 거 어때디 다타서 니업 그거 좀 있어서 그런 세트 그런 거 초보지 하고 있어요. 맞 그런 암초 뛰기 시작되는 They were the temperature do research.
Courage do research?
Then they will come some of them that was a research. Was it drink the blue the temperature
Drepung get on the sewage. Anjoguyata level. How can you get the timber is Ale
amjo chipu mare dia kharida jewa chadurna level gurim droni ani haku restaurant oh kosa di
kosa haku kite amjo insa mare shin de shimbaji isare
wangbo shimbaji isare wangbo shimba ale amjo insa mare di mai be shimbaji isare so the birds locate things by echolocation so he feels that it's not the air which perceives this location. There is something else which is able to locate its prey. So it's not the air, yeah.
In the back. Yeah, they use it. But it's still a very unique way.
그 다타가 군도 이미지들은 그 루트가 이미 하고는 말아 이 나를 하고서 말아 이놈이 미자 미자 헤이 나 봐도 내가 좀 어디 찍어라 암조디 쇼쇼 와도 나쇼 와도 미자도 나다 하고 있어 자 그러다 고세비 내가 딘도 펜스디
안 암조 베지 치마레 디나.
무슨 그들의 요인 암초 갖고 말했어.
하고 말해. Okay, so he said like, we samlo rada, so he thinks that so when he created a voice and he was able to locate without seeing, right? So he said the information went into the air and it is in the brain that it processed, and it's the brain which did this thing.
Yeah.
We are able to locate.
It's in the brain, and you know we have two ears, and sometimes the differential time at which information comes from into one ear versus the other ear may help in locating where the sound is coming from. But there seem to be some other processes that have been recently discovered as well that allow us to locate sound in space.
당연히 das cosa 거의 메주라 파나나라 디시엘라 치카리시고라나 안조 다디 안조나레 투조조라 디 투조 캐바두라스 딜라킹게 아니 마주기 디 카르모보디 거의 메 디시에 두고라스 코사디 당연히 아니 그림 심바야 탄다냐 처르니 레스 카시
자 저기 하면 나무 다른다 비교라 나무 다른다 비교하면 지나무라고 시작하기는 아니 레버나야 다마티 마루도 또 가르는 나무수 말해주고 아니 이 나무 마셔나기 안에 로칸다 주토요 그런 지리 나무 마셔니까 그이 로리 총은 나무 마셔라이나 그 다른 이 다른 사람들 주사 말해 가르질라
닐렘바디 카리 소르고 요레스 케시 소르고 요 말라나 촉사레스
내가 다마 데선데 마서 로바디 시르데 이나 타본 샤고
나무 이메 소르고 요 말라스
내가 다마 데가 나무 이거 소마리스 아니 때 마서나 아니 두루 로가 가면 줘 가다 로 가다지 디로 로 그냥 뭐라 소리라 야 내가 다마 데선데 마서 이 나무 마서나 티 지리 나무라 로 나무 로 말아 어디 가는
तो तंदा दिरो लेबल ले न मशीन ngamu re lani dushe dili yo marwas ra dila du bala chele gala yo kapsu di ro hande jores damati muela. So you said when we put something sweet in our mouth on the tongue, so it does not feel what this taste is like. It's a sweet one or bitter one, unless the information is passed on to the brain.
Correct.
So before the information is passed on to the brain, so what does it sense? What is that sense? Like, is it sweet or what does it feel?
It's simply sensing a chemical.
아니 소르게요 레스 거기 소레디 가리 소르볼라나 제직 소르게요 레스 너무 좀 계시요 말 제직 소르데요 레스 거랑게 제디 소야디 니수 야마당 공랄라라 제직 소르게요 레스 제직 요아디
나 좋아하더라 안에 당기 게임에 내가 미티게 대만 차오게 그리고이나 안에 너무 고요를 얘기했지 니 인소지 아니 지스 뒤시게 그래서 안에 대연나 배신 네 매니 기계 대화 차오 대만 차오지는 도게 대만 나오지는 도가이나 아니 거기 고요를 안에 대단히 능력 집을 넣어라시라
미 대화랑기
네 다 그런 매니는 그런 지구에는 안에 대집을 넣어 대 고요를 안에 대단데 안에 그진하고 대 등소 대뒤를 른서다 뒤시니께 그런 대집을 가리지 해서라
미치기 장울라고 장치기 차울라고 차레스
아니 서울하고 전에 되게 이루어서 되게다 아무것도 별로 지금 그지는 나오고 안에 되나 대 안에 되다 뒤시다 등소 뒤지 진지 안에서 뒤시다 른서다 안에 른서도 뒤시 진지 아니고 뒤잖아요 대권이 안에 되다 몰라 아니 그게 전체적인 연구를 좋아지지 이마데 안에
도구 민다 어떻게 로스라 뒤지 디 컨데스트 투 레스라
제가 다음 담보라 아니 매지게 매니요 담매니 지기 대만
차올라고 장치 담올라고 장 차올라고 장이 디교가 요로스
디 니게서 분이니까 고요디 안에 계단 나오고
아니 파 야렌테 디오
나오고 때문에 선다 아니 코니 른소도 미시 마지와데 집어라서 니게서
백술도 두시니 코라니 집어로스 안에 그진
담보 고요디 안에 디 기술아 안에 른소르지 디 기술 두시 지젠 그러잖아. 대나 다고 차와들은 나가 저거 거요도 안에 다고 되게 좋아. 이 끝이 되게 그래서 된다도
구겐 땡에
거요도 안에 되게 거요도 안에 되게 그래서 안에 차고 리자도 쳐요 뭐야. 쳐요 뭐야. 그래서
차오디 소리래라. 소레레스 이네 두셰 디케 마레스 차오 임바디.
아무 거요도 안에 눈이 뒤지게 눈이 서
단다 라고 창기라. 라고 창도 걸라 두셰 디케 마레스 이네 소르베요라디 차오지 임바. 차오 임바 하고 왜 마레스 이네 디 소르도 걸라 라바 디케 도고 치요레스.
그래서 거랑 차오 임바 하고 뭐라. 뒤시 많이 가서 아니 데고 요바 안에 지어 그게 간디
Khandes khari kengi. So you said that when a person touches a hot plate, so he quickly refrains it from touching, right? So what is that? What causes this person to take out his hand, like release that plate? So what is the what affects this hand to release? The kujen khari laure, shugen khari laure. Because you said the perception is not there about whether this plate is hot or cold, so but still he is able to retract his hand.
Yep. So here's the skin.
And
the sensory nerve in the skin. And it projects into the spinal cord. And it synapses onto other neurons. Some of those neurons project up to the brain. Okay, when it gets to the brain, it has to go through several other synapses. Before you can perceive it. Okay, but then there's also a direct connection between that neuron and a motor neuron, which then goes to the muscle. Okay, so the amount of time it takes for the information to go through here and back to the muscle is much shorter than the amount of time it takes for the information to travel up into the brain and then be processed for us to perceive it. So this is much faster, this what we call a spinal reflex. It's much faster than the processing of information through the brain. If we had to wait for the time it takes to process it in the brain and then the brain to send information back down to the spinal cord and then out to the muscle, you would have very, very severe burns. So these type of spinal reflexes are very important to protect ourselves.
디세바 제자라고 지금 같이
So can you tell us how long does it take for the information to perceive this sense of feeling of hotness? This information.
To perceive it?
Yeah, to perceive it.
Yeah, so this is probably a millisecond, and perception and response would be probably a second.
Neta di ro cha shastra di ro thanda manzo jungbe do khu jiwa di ro cha sha na karcha na sha na tongcha chik do cha go res ani di ro cha sha na di gurim dres do di karcha chik.
So this process is about 1,000 times faster.
Di la do gala di gurim ji dos di ni duro na dab chik dons ki jo dos ra tongcha chik di chik la ora karcha dab chik dons ki di jo go res.
기본적인 것들은 또 저는 어떤 뜻을 지을 가려는 처음에서 나타내 저는 어느 따라 거다 나는 좀 그런 거쳐 지금 나타내는 거쳐 되게 좀 못하지. 나들라도 거쳐 또 그냥 나타내는 처음부터 처음. 난 처음에는 그 원산으로 요구를. 원산을 요구하는 게 무엇이 그래요.
So we have learned in biology class that the plants when there is a danger, they send some chemical to other plants nearby, and these plants protect themselves from that particular disease or whatever is harming them. So, if there are no sense organs in these plants, how do these plants sense these chemicals?
Well, I think that plants do have sense organs.
Yores onze tanda di zishin na la onze mala yor di gonda wangsor yores wangsor wangbuden zo yores.
But they operate very differently than the sense organs in humans.
In ngaran zo mi na lo la wangsor wangbu ji yoras di da duru na manda shu res zishin na.
Anything else? Okay, I think it's lunchtime.
Ta shela parsen sim son sai.
Oh, was there another question?
And the two you. Do you want to have the last question?
All right, last question. Last question.
Tama di an di jela shela parsen ferosa.
No? Okay.
So after lunch or
After lunch.
yeah, the shela parsen jela yinda sa kala chodi.